Grant. I want to focus my comments on the question of migration and refugees in Europe, because I think history will speak a lot about the current period and how we're responding to it. Sometimes when you're in the thick of it, you don't actually recognise it for the dramatic and quite profound impact it's having on the world in a particular space and time, and indeed on world history. Now, the UNHCR tells us we're facing the most serious humanitarian crisis of refugees of our time, and that's mainly in relation to the Syrian refugees, but it also refers to Afghanis, Iraqis and Iranians in the main, but you've also got people coming from Africa. What the EU report does in terms of its report on migration is that it lauds, to a certain extent, the deal done with Turkey, and boasts that crossings from Turkey to the Greece island have sharply decreased and now almost come to a halt. And what really bothers me about these kind of reports is the sort of language that they use when they talk about people who are fleeing war, famine, persecution, imprisonment, disappearance, rape, you name it, all sorts of torture and all sorts of humanitarian reasons for tens of thousands, millions of people leaving their own country. Nobody really wants to get out of Syria, except they're facing bombs being dropped from the air that are loaded with oil and petrol, except that they're facing Russian soldiers destroying their towns and cities and increasingly killing their children and women and destroying families. That is the reason why people leave. And if others could, they would also leave, like, for example, the Palestinians who've been starved and isolated in the Aramut camp in Damascus. There are lots and lots of pockets of Syria that even aid is not being brought to, because, as we heard from a whistleblower from the United Nations here recently in the Dáil, who gave a presentation, much of the aid is being diverted by the Assad regime away from where it's absolutely and fundamentally needed. And this report from the European Union lauds the progress that's been made in holding back and in corralling and containing some of the most desperate people on the planet at the moment. It also makes reference to an action plan called the Valletta Action Plan, which I think we should remind ourselves, this is all about the European Union handing over vast chunks of money. In the case of the Valletta Action Plan, which was agreed in Malta in late 2015, €1.8 billion as a minimum to be handed over and shared between countries like Algeria, Burkina Faso, Sudan. The President couldn't even attend the talks in Malta because there's an international arrest warrant out for him because of his human rights violations. These are the type of countries that the European Union is pouring funding into. Similarly, in Tunisia, the Human Rights Watch have expressed grave concerns on new laws that imperil human rights there and lack adequate safeguards against abuses. Now, we've spoken at length, many of us, about our concerns of all of the deals that were done with Turkey and all of the EU money that's been given to Turkey to corral, to contain and imprison over 3 million refugees. And that continues to be a concern, but I'm afraid the EU is not concerned at all. In fact, it lauds it and says there's fast and operational returns of migrants, leverages are being used in terms of development and trade, and this is a progressive European Union model. And I want to endorse and echo what's just been said by Deputy Coppinger. Those who think for a minute, and many of them are in Britain actually, because Britain hasn't faced a bailout the same way that we did, hasn't faced the imposition of directives from Europe the same way as ourselves, the Greeks, the Spanish and the Portuguese did. And they think somehow that this is a progressive entity that does wonderful things on behalf of the human race. For God's sake, look at their attitude to migration, their attitude to immigrants and their attitude to, as declared by Amnesty International, the most serious humanitarian crisis in refugees of our time. And the European Union are dealing with it as if they were like bunches of animals or wild bison or something to be corralled behind fences. And even the commitment they made under the EU-Turkey deal, they are not delivering on. Instead, refugees from Greece are being been sent back to Turkey, despite the opposition by the refugees themselves, and despite the fact that within Greece, and I've seen this with my own eyes recently on a visit to Athens, to many of the refugee camps in the airport, in the stadia, in the industrial estates around Athens, the people of Greece are lauded by the refugees for their decency, their kindness, their willingness to open their homes, and their willingness to give kindness to some of the most desperate people in the world. And this is despite the fact that these people are being the ones most hammered by austerity, by cutbacks and by bailouts. Now, what we are witnessing is actually the rest of Europe, beyond the boundaries of Greece, the richest part of the planet, turning its back on the poorest and most desperate parts of the world. Even this government in this House, and Deputy Flanagan could comment on it if he gets to speak on this, why in the name of God we have not even fulfilled our meagre, miserable commitment to begin to take in the 4,000 refugees that we talked about taking in from Syria. We're miles behind doing it, and yet we still have, we're not sure, but we still have at least 250,000 empty properties in this country that could adequately house the people on the waiting list, the homeless, the people who are screaming for accommodation, and those who need it coming in from elsewhere. Indeed, people in direct provision are probably being treated a little bit better than those in the camps in Turkey. So I think this report from the European Union only confirms my, and I would say most people with a heart instead of a swinging brick, a conviction that the European Union is indeed completely racist, completely aggressive towards migrants seeking refuge and seeking food and shelter and safety, many of whom are children. What does that say about our European rulers? What does that say about the Great Commission, whom the people of Britain are supposed to have turned their backs on? It says everything about the inhumanity, the cruelty, the selfishness, the greed, and the very good reasons why this union as it exists should be broken up and a different kind of Europe put together, a Europe that puts people before profit.
Deputy Coventry.